Hi everyone and welcome back. Well, most people would think that democracy is the highest form of power. Well, it isn't. There is a legal layer that sits above it, one that doesn't get voted on, but it quietly shapes how ownership, contracts and courts work all the way across the entire world, really. And the funny thing is that it's hardly ever talked about. Nobody really even knows that this organisation even exists. Now, before we go any further, I just want to make it really clear from the start, this channel and most of its contents, in fact all of its contents, isn't about conspiracy. This is about modern power and how it actually works and how it operates in today's society, because today, power doesn't need to shout, jump up and down. It doesn't need elections. It doesn't need your vote. And it certainly doesn't need any type of force. It works very quietly in the background through rules, through standards, and through legal coordination. See, most people grow up believing that power flows something like this. What have we got? We've got voters who elect a government. We've got government who then puts laws in place. They create laws. And then we've got courts that enforce those laws. And then out of that spits us a society. Now, that model, it made sense in a national or nationalist industrialized world, but the reality is that we no longer live in that world. We live in a globalized, financialized, contractual system. That's what it is today, where capital moves a lot faster than politics, than day-to-day politics, and law has to work across borders, not just within them, and that creates a fairly big problem. A big problem for global systems. See, if money, assets and contracts want to move internationally across borders, but laws themselves don't because they're different, then uncertainty is exploding. It's going to explode. Each country has different rules. We know that. Each country's got different courts, different definitions of ownership, different outcomes to every different situation. For global trade and for global finance, well, that's a possibility and the potential for chaos. So the question then became, how do you make ownership and contracts predictable when countries all have different legal systems? So this is where an organisation called UNIDROIT comes in. UNIDROIT. UNIDROIT stands for the International Institution for the Unification of Private Law. UNIDROIT was founded in 1926. It was founded by a group that you may have heard of. They're called the League of Nations. And today it's an independent, intergovernmental body, and it's based in Rome. And Australia is a member. I believe there's 63 countries. But there's definitely a lot more countries involved than just Australia. And UNIDROIT doesn't actually make any laws as such. It doesn't govern or control any countries from the shadows or any of that sort of stuff. But what it does do is a lot more subtle. So UNIDROIT standardises the principles of private law. It helps define what ownership actually means across the board. It helps define how contracts are interpreted and how secured interests work. And these principles are then adopted by the countries into treaties. They're copied into our domestic legislation, and that then means that they're going to be cited by our courts, relied on in arbitration, and over time they become basically the default framework. And none of this is because anybody voted for them, of course. This is because everyone needs to use the same rule book. And this is where obviously things start to get a little bit more interesting. See, power no longer sits primarily with our politicians, or leaders, as some people want to call them. It sits with those who design the frameworks that everyone must basically rely on. And this is made up of legal scholars and maybe commercial lawyers, banking and trade experts, and maybe arbitration bodies, that kind of thing. But remember, the most important thing is that none of these are actually elected individuals. They're not really visible, openly talked about, openly known about, but they are enormously influential. Because once one of their frameworks becomes standard, well, opting out becomes almost impossible. Now, does this mean that democracy itself has completely disappeared? Well, maybe not. But you'd have to say that it's definitely changed it, because democracy now operates inside boundaries that it didn't actually design. Parliaments will debate policies. Elections will change the government that's in power at the time. But the rules of ownership, enforcement, and obligation are increasingly preset higher up the chain. So democracy manages the room, if you like. The framework of UNIDROIT decides the walls. Most people never actually even consider or notice this layer because it doesn't directly affect daily politics. You're not going to hear about it in the news. It doesn't show up in any of the headlines. It's technical. It's not something that's emotional. It sounds boring by design, but it's obviously very important. But see, if you own anything, basically, if you own property, if you are a director of a company, if you own a business, if you've got investments of any type, or even just a bank account, which pretty much everybody has, you're actually operating inside it. You're participating in it. See, ownership today is less about possession and more about recognised legal relationships. And those relationships are increasingly standardised globally. So UNIDROIT wasn't necessarily designed to control individuals as such, but it was designed to control uncertainty, or maybe to stop uncertainty, to prevent it. But when you are going to be able to control uncertainty, well, you can also then control outcomes. So you decide which claims are going to actually stand up and survive. You'll decide which contracts are enforceable, which interests are going to take priority, which courts align with the globalized norms. And in my view, that is serious power, even if it never appears on a ballot, even if we don't vote for it. So this video isn't about panic. It's about understanding the world that it actually is today, revealing things that might have been hidden in the shadows, maybe not the way we were taught that it was. So power today doesn't sit in governments, not really. And it doesn't live in elections. People often say, it doesn't matter who you vote for, you get the same thing. because the power sits further upstream in the legal architecture that quietly shapes everything beneath it. And UNIDROIT is just one layer. And in part 2 of this little 2-part series that I'm going to do, we're going to look really deep at what this means in real life and how it affects your property titles and your ownership. I've talked about that in some other videos, but maybe we'll dig a bit deeper. Banking, in courts, all of these matters affect us. We'll talk about what ownership really means in the modern system. If you haven't watched any of my other videos, we'll see it in the next one. Because once you actually understand and see this framework, well, you can't then unsee it. It'll help you make sense of things. So, thanks very much for watching. Part 2 will be coming soon, and that's where this starts to get a little bit more practical. If you found this video helpful or informative, make sure that you hit the like, subscribe, make sure you throw a comment down below, let me know what your thoughts are, share it with a friend, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.